Max took a playful step forward, his scuffed sneakers crunching through a patch of dry leaves on the forest edge. The vibrant sunlight filtered through the swaying canopy, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. It had started as a simple game, a harmless escape into nature. He had ventured a little further than usual, chasing the flicker of a squirrel's tail, ignoring the slight tug of unease in his stomach. Then it happened. A tree root, hidden beneath a carpet of moss and fallen leaves, snagged his foot. Max stumbled forward, his arms flailing to break his fall. The soft earth caught him, his knees sinking into the cool soil, the sharp scent of crushed greenery filling his nose. He stayed there for a moment, startled, brushing dirt from his scraped palms. When he finally stood, brushing off his jeans, he glanced around to reorient himself. But the world seemed to have shifted. The cluster of trees he thought he recognized now looked indistinct. Their trunks rose like shadowy sentinels, each resembling the next. The sunlight that had been so warm and inviting moments ago seemed weaker, its rays scattered and uncertain. Max turned in a slow circle, squinting into the depths of the forest, trying to pick out a familiar landmark. A tree with a distinctive knot, a bush laden with berries, anything. Nothing. He inhaled deeply, the cool forest air filling his lungs, and called out, "Mom? Dad!" His voice rang out, bouncing off the tall oaks and maples, only to be swallowed by the forest's vastness. He waited, hoping for a distant shout in return, but silence pressed in instead, a dense, suffocating quiet that only seemed to amplify the rustle of leaves overhead. Max tried to retrace his steps, but every direction looked the same. The forest stretched endlessly, trees packed tightly together like an unyielding maze. Each path seemed to double back on itself, leading nowhere. His breathing quickened, his chest heaving as panic crept in. He bolted in one direction, then another, his steps becoming erratic. The undergrowth caught at his legs, scratching and tugging at his jeans. Sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the coolness of the forest. His hands trembled as he brushed aside a low-hanging branch, his heart hammering loudly in his ears. "Think, Max, think," he muttered to himself, his voice a fragile anchor in the overwhelming stillness. He tried to remember the survival tips his dad had once rambled about during a camping trip. Follow a stream? Look for moss on trees? His memory was a frustrating blur, the advice half-remembered and useless. A wave of loneliness washed over him, so strong it nearly brought him to his knees. The forest, which had always been a place of adventure and wonder, now felt immense and alien. Tears blurred his vision, and he swiped at them furiously with his sleeve, ashamed of his fear. He was 11, not a baby, but no amount of bravado could hold back the sobs that escaped, ragged and raw. He kept moving, driven by desperation. The light above dimmed further as the sun began its slow descent, the shadows lengthening and stretching across the forest floor like dark fingers. The idea of nightfall filled Max with dread. The thought of being enveloped in the blackness, with no way to find his way back, made his skin crawl. A sharp crack in the distance, a branch snapping, made him freeze mid-step. His breath hitched, his wide eyes scanning the dim surroundings. Was it an animal? A person? "Hello," he called, his voice shaky, the sound barely audible over the pounding of his heart. Nothing. Just the persistent rustle of leaves and the faint creak of the forest as the wind teased the tree branches. He wished desperately for the comforting noise of the world he had left behind, the hum of his bike tires on the pavement, the chatter of his parents' voices in the kitchen. Max stumbled forward again, his small hands clutching the bark of a tree for support. The rough texture bit into his palms, grounding him for a moment. He leaned his forehead against the trunk, closing his eyes tightly as he tried to block out the swelling tide of hopelessness. The tears came again, hot and fast, trailing down his dirt-streaked face. Every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of his own footsteps, the occasional distant bird call, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the brush. He was hyper-aware of everything around him, yet he felt completely invisible, as though the forest itself had swallowed him whole. It was humiliating, this loss of control. Max prided himself on being brave, on taking the lead when he and his friends explored the woods near his house. But now, stripped of the familiar, he felt small and powerless. He sank to the ground, pulling his knees to his chest and hugging them tightly, his small body trembling. "Someone's looking for me," he whispered to himself, the words an anchor against the growing despair. His parents would notice he was missing. They would call for him, search the forest. Maybe they already were. Maybe he just needed to stay in one spot, and they'd find him. Or maybe he needed to keep moving to find the edge of the forest himself. The indecision paralyzed him. He rocked slightly, his eyes scanning the dense thicket ahead. He was tired, his legs aching from trudging through the uneven terrain. His throat was dry, the thought of water gnawing at him. The daylight was fading fast now, the golden hues of the sunset barely penetrating the thick canopy. Max clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "I'll find my way out," he muttered, forcing himself to his feet. He wiped his nose on his sleeve, determined to push past the fear that threatened to consume him. But as he took his next step, the forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees pressing together like silent sentinels, their shadows swallowing him whole. The air in the forest seemed to change as the last rays of sunlight disappeared. Max's breath came in short, uneven gasps, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to calm himself. His scraped hands clenched tightly in a fist at his sides, but it didn't stop the tremor in his fingers. The forest had grown impossibly still, so still, in fact, that it felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. Even the occasional rustle of leaves or chirp of a bird had vanished, leaving behind a thick, suffocating silence. Max stood frozen, unsure whether to move or stay put. His mind raced, filled with fragments of thoughts and fears that he couldn't seem to hold on long enough to make sense of them. His eyes darted to every shadow between the trees, convinced that something, anything, might jump out at him. Then it came, a sound, a crack. Max flinched violently as the unmistakable sound of a branch snapping echoed through the forest. It wasn't the kind of sound caused by a breeze or falling debris. It was deliberate, heavy like something or someone had stepped on it. His head whipped toward the noise, his eyes wide with fear. In the dim light of the setting sun, he saw nothing at first, just the endless shadows of trees stretching on forever. But then movement, a dark shape shifted in the corner of his vision, low to the ground and impossibly large. Max's breath caught in his throat as he squinted, hoping against hope that his eyes were playing tricks on him. Another crack, this time closer. He turned sharply and saw it. Emerging from the shadows, its massive bulk moving with unnerving grace, was a bear. The creature's fur looked almost black in the fading light, its eyes catching the dim glow as they locked onto him. Max stumbled back a step, his legs feeling like jelly. Before he could even process what he was seeing, another shape appeared, then another. To his horror, 4 bears stepped into the clearing, their movements slow but purposeful. They surrounded him, their hulking bodies forming an unbroken circle. Max's heart pounded so hard in his chest that it felt like it might burst. He knew better than to scream or run, at least he thought he did. But every instinct screamed at him to do something, anything, to escape. His mouth went dry as his eyes darted between the bears, each one enormous, their breaths visible in the cool evening air. One of the bears stepped closer, its enormous paws crunching softly on the underbrush. Max could see the muscles rippling beneath its fur, the faint gleam of its sharp teeth as it opened its mouth slightly, sniffing the air. He realized with a sickening twist of his stomach that it was smelling him. Max took a step back, his foot catching on a root. He stumbled, but managed to stay upright, though his arms flailed uselessly. The humiliation of his clumsiness burned in his chest, but the fear drowned out everything else. He was shaking so badly that he could barely stay on his feet. The bears didn't move quickly. There was no need. They watched him, their dark eyes filled with a quiet intelligence that made Max feel even smaller, even more powerless. He was nothing to them, just a scared, helpless boy standing alone in their territory. "Go away," Max whispered, his voice trembling so badly that the words were barely audible even to him. "Please." The largest bear tilted its head slightly, as though considering him. It took another step closer, its sheer size almost impossible to comprehend. Max backed up again, only to find himself pressed against the rough bark of a tree. There was nowhere else to go. His mind raced with half-formed plans. Climb the tree? Play dead? Scream? But his body refused to move. He was paralyzed by fear, his legs locked in place, his hands gripping the bark behind him so tightly that his nails scraped against it. One of the smaller bears huffed, a deep, guttural sound that sent a chill down Max's spine. Another bear pawed at the ground, its claws raking through the dirt as though testing it. Every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive silence, each breath and movement of the bears filling the air with tension so thick it was almost suffocating. "Someone's coming," Max whispered to himself, desperate for any shred of hope. "They'll find me. They have to find me." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. The forest felt endless, indifferent to his plight. The largest bear moved closer still, now only a few feet away. Its massive head swung low, sniffing the air near him. Max pressed himself harder against the tree, his body trembling uncontrollably. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, and he blinked them away furiously, unwilling to let himself cry. Not now, but the humiliation of his fear weighed on him, crushing him just as much as the bear's presence. He thought of his friends, his parents, the life he had taken for granted outside this forest. How had it come to this? How had he ended up here, alone and surrounded by creatures that could end him with a single swipe of their claws? The bear closest to him let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through the ground beneath Max's feet. His knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, his back still pressed against the tree. He wrapped his arms around his knees, trying to make himself as small as possible. The humiliation of his helplessness was overwhelming. He was no hero, no brave adventurer. He was just a scared kid, lost in the woods and surrounded by something he couldn't hope to fight or escape. Max squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to disappear, to wake up in his own bed and realize this had all been a nightmare. But when he opened his eyes again, the bears were still there, their dark shapes looming over him, their breaths heavy and measured. For the first time, Max felt truly alone, truly powerless. And as the largest bear stepped even closer, its dark eyes boring into his, he felt the crushing weight of the reality he couldn't escape. Max's entire body trembled as the bears loomed around him. The forest was silent except for the occasional crunch of twigs and leaves under the massive paws of the creatures. His back pressed hard against the rough bark of the tree behind him, his nails digging into the wood as though he could somehow disappear into it. His breath was shallow and uneven, his chest rising and falling rapidly as his eyes darted between the four bears. The largest of them stood directly in front of him, its sheer size eclipsing the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. Its black eyes, glinting faintly in the dim light, locked onto Max, holding him in a trance of raw fear. The boy's mind raced with 1,000 panicked thoughts. Every story he had ever heard about bear attacks played out in vivid detail. He could almost feel the weight of the creature's claws tearing into him, the sharp sting of its teeth. And yet, as the bear stepped forward, there was no rush, no aggressive movement. Its gait was slow, deliberate. The sound of its heavy breathing filled the air between them, warm puffs of mist visible in the cool night. Max's legs felt like lead, frozen in place. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but all he could do was stare as the enormous animal closed the distance between them. The bear stopped a foot away, its immense head lowering slightly. Max squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself for the inevitable. The tears on his cheeks felt cold against his skin, a humiliating reminder of how utterly powerless he was. And then it happened. A gentle touch. Max's eyes shot open, his breath hitching in his throat. The bear's nose, wet, cold, and surprisingly soft, pressed lightly against his arm. It sniffed him once, its nostrils flaring as it took in his scent. Max froze, every muscle in his body locked in place, his mind unable to comprehend what was happening. This wasn't an attack. The touch wasn't harsh or violent. It was curious. The bear tilted its head slightly, its dark eyes studying him with an intensity that made Max feel even smaller than he already was. He was shaking so badly now that he was sure the bear could feel the tremors through the contact. The boy's breaths came in shallow gasps, his chest tight with both fear and a growing sense of confusion. "What?" he whispered, his voice so soft it was barely audible even to himself. The bear didn't react to his voice, but its nose moved again, this time gently brushing against the fabric of his shirt. The sensation was surreal, terrifying, yes, but also strangely grounding. For a brief moment, Max's mind quieted, his racing thoughts replaced by the raw reality of the moment. Behind the large bear, the others began to move. Max's gaze darted toward them, panic flaring once more. Were they closing in? Was this a coordinated attack? But no, they weren't advancing toward him. Instead, they shifted their positions, their massive bodies circling around him in slow, deliberate movements. The realization hit Max like a wave. They were forming a protective ring. The bears settled into place, their powerful frames creating an impenetrable wall of fur and muscle around him. Their movements were calm, almost methodical, as though this was something they had done countless times before. Max's head spun with the impossibility of it all. Why weren't they attacking? What were they doing? The largest bear leaned in closer, its wet nose now just inches from Max's face. Its breath was warm, carrying the earthy scent of the forest. Max's hands gripped the bark behind him so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He didn't dare move, didn't even blink as the bear's eyes met his. The connection was strange. For a moment, Max felt like the bear was trying to tell him something, though what that could be, he had no idea. Its gaze wasn't hostile or predatory. If anything, it was calm, watchful, almost understanding. The sheer intelligence behind those eyes sent a shiver down Max's spine. Another soft huff escaped the bear's mouth, the sound low and rumbling, but not threatening. It felt more like a signal, a reassurance, perhaps, though Max couldn't be sure. His chest tightened, the tension inside him threatening to boil over. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body refused to obey. The other bears remained in their positions, their heads turning occasionally as though scanning the darkness around them. They made no move toward him, no growls or signs of aggression. Instead, they seemed calm, guarded but calm. The largest bear shifted slightly, its head tilting as it sniffed at Max's shoulder. The boy's breath hitched again, his whole body trembling violently. The humiliation of his fear burned in his chest, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. He was at their mercy, completely and utterly helpless. And yet, the bears didn't seem to want to harm him. They were enormous, powerful creatures, each one capable of ending him with a single swipe of their claws. But they didn't. Instead, they simply watched him, their protective circle holding steady. Max's thoughts swirled in a chaotic mess. Was this some kind of game to them? Were they toying with him before finishing the job? Or was it something else entirely? He couldn't make sense of it. All he knew was that he was alive and surrounded by something he couldn't hope to understand. The largest bear pulled back slightly, its nose no longer touching him. It sat back on its haunches with a heavy thud, its eyes never leaving Max's face. The other bears followed suit, their massive forms settling into the underbrush like silent sentinels. Max sat frozen, his back still pressed against the tree. His body ached from the tension, his muscles screaming for relief, but he didn't dare move. He didn't want to do anything that might break the delicate balance of the moment. The largest bear let out another soft rumble, its gaze steady and unyielding. Max's mind raced with questions he couldn't hope to answer. Why were they protecting him? What did they want? The circle of bears remained, their presence both terrifying and strangely reassuring. Max's breath came in slow, uneven gasps as he struggled to process what was happening. The forest around him seemed to fade away, its vast darkness replaced by the surreal reality of the bears and their inexplicable behavior. All Max could do was sit there, trembling and confused, as the bears watched over him like guardians in the night. Max remained rooted to the ground, his back pressed against the rough bark of the tree, unable to move or think beyond the surreal presence of the bears surrounding him. Their watchful eyes remained fixed on him, calm yet unwavering, as if waiting for something. His body trembled uncontrollably, every nerve frayed from the tension that had gripped him since the moment they appeared. The largest bear, sitting directly in front of him, shifted slightly, its massive form rising with a deliberate slowness. Max flinched, his breath hitching in his throat as he pressed himself further into the tree. The bear stood to its full height, a towering figure that seemed to block out the faint light of the moon above. It exhaled deeply, a low rumble accompanying the sound, before turning its head slightly, as though signaling to the others. To Max's surprise, the other bears began to move, not toward him, but away. One by one, they rose and lumbered in a loose formation, their massive bodies moving with an unsettling grace through the dense underbrush. The largest bear was the last to move, its dark eyes locking on Max's one final time before turning to follow the others. Max sat frozen, his mind a blur of confusion and fear. Were they leaving? Was it over? He wanted to let out a sigh of relief, but something stopped him. The largest bear had paused a few steps ahead, turning its massive head to glance back at him. It let out a low huff, a sound that carried more weight than Max could understand. It wasn't leaving. It was waiting. The realization hit Max like a jolt. The bear wasn't abandoning him. It wanted him to follow. No, Max whispered under his breath, shaking his head as panic bubbled up again. I can't. But the bear didn't move. It stood there, its silhouette blending into the shadows of the forest, waiting with an eerie patience. The other bears had stopped as well, their hulking forms visible in the faint moonlight, standing still as though guarding the path ahead. Max's legs felt like jelly as he slowly pushed himself to his feet. His fingers clutched the tree behind him for support, his knees wobbling beneath him. Every instinct told him to stay put, to cling to the tree and hope that the bears would eventually disappear into the forest. But another part of him, the part that still held on to a shred of hope, urged him to move. He took one shaky step forward, then another. His legs felt heavy, each step a monumental effort as he inched toward the largest bear. The creature stood silently, watching him with an intensity that made Max's skin prickle. When he was close enough to reach out and touch it, the bear turned and began to walk again, its steps slow and deliberate. Max hesitated, glancing back at the tree that had been his only source of comfort. The thought of leaving its safety filled him with dread, but the bears were already moving, their massive forms disappearing into the shadows. With a deep, trembling breath, Max forced himself to follow. The path through the forest was uneven and treacherous, the ground littered with roots and fallen branches that threatened to trip him with every step. Max's sneakers slipped on the damp leaves, and more than once he stumbled, catching himself on nearby trees. His humiliation grew with each clumsy misstep, the knowledge that the bears were moving effortlessly ahead of him only making it worse. They never strayed far, though. The largest bear always stayed just within sight, glancing back occasionally to ensure Max was following. The others flanked him, their presence both terrifying and strangely reassuring. They moved silently, their powerful bodies cutting through the dense forest with ease, their fur brushing against branches that seemed to part for them. Max's breaths came in ragged gasps as he struggled to keep up. His legs burned from the effort, his scraped hands stinging with each brush against rough bark. He felt small and insignificant, like a lost child being shepherded by creatures that dwarfed him in every way. After what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin. The oppressive darkness of the forest gave way to a faint glow the silvery light of the moon reflecting off something ahead. Max squinted, his heart pounding as he realized what it was: a clearing. The bears moved into the open space ahead, their hulking forms illuminated by the moonlight. The clearing was unlike anything Max had ever seen. The ground was covered in a soft, velvety moss that seemed to shimmer faintly in the pale light. A small stream wound its way through the center, its crystal-clear water bubbling softly over smooth stones. The sound of the stream was gentle and soothing, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence of the forest. The largest bear stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned to face Max. Its dark eyes met his, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other. Max's chest tightened, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He didn't understand what the bear wanted from him, what any of this meant. Then, with a low rumble, the bear lowered itself onto the moss, its massive body settling into a relaxed position. The other bears followed suit, each one finding a spot around the clearing to lie down. They moved with a calmness that Max couldn't comprehend, as though this was a ritual they had performed countless times before. Max stood at the edge of the clearing, his legs trembling beneath him. The exhaustion of the night was catching up to him, the weight of his fear and confusion threatening to overwhelm him. He glanced at the stream, the cool water glinting invitingly in the moonlight. His throat felt dry, his lips cracked and parched. Slowly, hesitantly, he took a step toward the stream. The moss beneath his feet was soft, almost spongy, cushioning his every step. He knelt at the edge of the water, his reflection rippling in the gentle current. He cupped his hands and dipped them into the stream, the cold water sending a shock through his system. Bringing it to his lips, he drank deeply, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. For the first time since he had entered the forest, he felt a flicker of relief. The bears watched him in silence, their eyes following his every move. Their presence was still overwhelming, a constant reminder of their power and his vulnerability. But they made no move to harm him. As Max sank back onto the moss, his body finally relaxing, the humiliation of the night lingered like a weight on his chest. He had been reduced to nothing, a scared, clumsy boy relying on creatures he didn't understand to guide him. And yet he was still alive. For now, that was enough. Max stirred as the first rays of sunlight broke through the dense canopy above, illuminating the small clearing where he had spent the night. His body ached from exhaustion, and the damp chill of the forest clung to his skin. For a brief moment, he couldn't remember where he was or how he had gotten there. But then the events of the previous night came rushing back, and his eyes darted to the bears. They were still there. The largest bear lay a few feet away, its massive body rising and falling with the rhythm of its slow, steady breaths. The others were scattered around the clearing, their positions forming a loose circle around him. They looked peaceful, almost serene, but their sheer size and power still made Max's stomach churn with unease. Despite the strange calm they had shown, the memory of their looming presence in the darkness lingered like a shadow over his thoughts. Max shifted slightly, his muscles stiff from sleeping on the moss-covered ground. The movement caught the attention of the largest bear, which opened its dark eyes and fixed them on him. Max froze, his breath hitching in his throat. Even after everything that had happened, he couldn't shake the fear that any sudden movement might provoke the creature. But the bear didn't move. It simply watched him, its gaze steady and unreadable, as though it were waiting for something. Max exhaled shakily, the tension in his chest easing just slightly. He was still alive, and for now, that was enough. The quiet of the morning was broken by a sound that made Max's heart leap. Voices. Faint and distant at first, they grew louder with each passing moment, cutting through the stillness of the forest like a lifeline. Max sat up abruptly, his pulse quickening. He strained to hear, his ears honing in on the sound of human voices calling his name. Max! Max, are you there? His breath caught in his throat, tears welling up in his eyes. It was them, rescuers, his parents. They were looking for him. A wave of emotion crashed over him, relief mingling with a deep, overwhelming humiliation. He had been lost, helpless, and now they would find him like this, a frightened, dirty boy who had needed to be saved. The voices grew closer, and Max scrambled to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He turned toward the sound, ready to run toward it, but then hesitated. The bears. The largest one was still watching him, its head slightly tilted as though it could sense his turmoil. The other bears began to stir, their hulking forms shifting as they rose from their positions on the moss. Max's heart pounded as he glanced between the bears and the direction of the voices. He didn't know what to do, didn't know if running would trigger some hidden aggression. Max! The voices were louder now, the sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush echoing through the trees. The largest bear took a step back, its massive paws sinking slightly into the soft moss. It let out a low rumble, not threatening but almost final. The other bears followed suit, their movements slow and deliberate as they began to retreat toward the edge of the clearing. Max watched in stunned silence as the circle around him broke, the bears moving as one toward the shadows of the forest. "Wait," Max whispered, though he wasn't sure why. The bears didn't stop. They didn't look back. Their massive forms melted into the darkness of the trees, their presence fading like a dream. Max stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The clearing felt emptier now, the absence of the bears leaving a strange hollowness in the air. He didn't understand why they had acted the way they had, why they had guided him to safety and then left without a sound. The questions swirled in his mind, but there were no answers, only the fading echo of their presence. Max! The sound of his name, closer than ever, jolted him back to reality. He turned toward the voices, his throat tightening as the realization hit him fully. He was going to be found. He stumbled toward the edge of the clearing, his legs weak and unsteady, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could see them now, figures moving through the trees, their bright jackets standing out against the dark green of the forest. "Here!" Max shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm here!" The rescuers broke into a run, their shouts growing louder as they closed the distance between them. Max's knees buckled as the first figure reached him, a man in a bright orange vest who dropped to his knees and grabbed Max by the shoulders. "You're safe now," the man said, his voice firm but kind. "We've got you." Max's eyes filled with tears as he nodded, unable to find the words to respond. More rescuers appeared, their faces etched with relief as they surrounded him. Someone draped a blanket over his shoulders, the warmth a sharp contrast to the cool morning air. And then he saw them, his parents. His mother rushed toward him, her face pale and streaked with tears. She threw her arms around him, pulling him into a tight embrace that made his chest ache. "Oh, Max," she sobbed, her voice trembling. We thought we'd lost you." "I'm okay," Max managed to whisper, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure if he was okay. His body was safe, yes, but his mind was a tangled mess of fear, confusion, and shame. His father placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "You're so brave, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're so proud of you." Max's throat tightened, the humiliation burning in his chest. Brave? Proud? He wanted to believe them, but all he could think about was how terrified he had been, how helpless and small he had felt in the face of the forest and its shadows. As the rescuers led him out of the clearing, Max glanced back one last time. The bears were gone, their presence erased as though they had never been there at all. But the memory of them lingered, silent guardians who had appeared when he needed them most and disappeared just as quietly. Max turned back toward the rescuers, his steps slow and unsteady as they guided him through the forest. The relief of being found was tempered by the weight of everything he had experienced, a weight he wasn't sure he would ever fully understand. But as the trees began to thin and the light of the morning grew brighter, he held on to one thought. He was alive. And for now, that was enough. The days following Max's rescue were a blur of relief, exhaustion, and overwhelming emotions. Back home, tucked safely into the familiar walls of his room, he still felt the weight of the forest clinging to him. He could close his eyes and see the towering trees, the endless shadows, and most vividly, the bears. Every detail of their hulking forms, their deliberate movements, and their piercing gazes replayed in his mind like a movie he couldn't shut off. Max's parents hovered over him, their relief almost suffocating. His mother checked on him constantly, bringing him food, fluffing his pillows, and watching him with tear-filled eyes that reminded him how close he had come to being lost forever. His father tried to reassure him with words about his bravery and resilience, though those words only deepened the hollow feeling inside him. Brave? How could they call him brave? All he had done was cry, tremble, and rely on animals to save him. The humiliation of his helplessness burned in his chest, a constant reminder of how small and powerless he had felt. But amidst the embarrassment and confusion, something else began to grow, a nagging thought that wouldn't leave him alone. The bears. Why hadn't they hurt him? Why had they stayed with him, guided him through the forest, and watched over him like guardians? It didn't make sense. Every story he had ever heard about bears painted them as dangerous, unpredictable creatures to be feared and avoided at all costs. Yet those bears had been different. They had chosen not to harm him. More than that, they had chosen to help him. Lying in bed late one night, unable to sleep, Max stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the moment when the largest bear had touched him with its nose. It had been gentle, almost tender, as though the bear had been trying to tell him something. The memory sent a shiver down his spine, not from fear, but from the enormity of what it meant. Those bears had made a choice. They had saved him, and for the first time since he had been rescued, Max felt something other than fear or shame. He felt gratitude. The next morning, Max woke early, his mind buzzing with restless energy. He dressed quickly, pulling on his favorite hoodie and a pair of worn sneakers, and slipped out of the house before his parents could stop him. The crisp morning air hit his face as he stepped outside, the sunlight filtering through the trees in his backyard. It was so quiet, so peaceful, yet it carried an energy that made his heart race. Max didn't go far, just to the edge of the woods where his ordeal had begun. He stopped at the tree line, his feet sinking slightly into the soft earth, and looked into the shadows beyond. The forest seemed different now, less menacing than it had that night, but still vast and mysterious. He stood there for a long time, his hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets, trying to find the words for the feelings swirling inside him. "Thank you," he whispered finally, his voice barely audible over the faint rustle of leaves. It felt strange to say it out loud, but it also felt right. He wasn't sure if the bears could hear him or if they were even still in the area, but he needed to say it. For them, for himself. "I don't know why you helped me, but thank you." Max's voice wavered as he spoke, a lump forming in his throat. He hadn't cried since the night he was found, determined to prove, to himself, to his parents, that he was strong, that he wasn't the scared little boy who had been lost and helpless in the dark. But now, standing at the edge of the forest, he felt the tears welling up again, hot and unstoppable. He wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed even though no one was there to see him. The weight of everything he had experienced, the fear, the confusion, the strange, unexplainable kindness of the bears, pressed down on him all at once. He sank to his knees, the damp earth soaking through his jeans, and let the tears come. For a long time, he just sat there, staring into the forest with watery eyes. He thought about how close he had come to losing everything, his family, his life, and how the bears, these wild, powerful creatures, had stepped in when he needed them most. It didn't make sense, and maybe it never would, but the gratitude in his chest felt like a flame that wouldn't go out. Max thought back to the way the largest bear had looked at him, its dark eyes calm and knowing. There had been something almost human in that gaze, something that made him feel small but not insignificant. The forest had been terrifying, yes, but in that moment it had also been kind. And that kindness was something Max couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, Max found himself drawn to the forest again and again. He didn't venture far, never more than a few steps beyond the tree line, but each time he stood there, he felt a little braver. He started to notice things he hadn't before, the way the sunlight dappled the ground through the leaves, the soft hum of insects in the air, the faint scent of pine and moss. The forest was alive, a world unto itself, and Max couldn't shake the feeling that he owed it something. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Max sat on a fallen log at the edge of the woods, a notebook balanced on his knees. He had started writing down everything he could remember about the bears and the night they had saved him. It wasn't much, just fragmented memories of their movements, their sounds, the way they had watched him with those unblinking eyes. But it felt important to preserve it, as though writing it down might help him understand. As he wrote, Max found himself smiling for the first time in days. The humiliation he had felt after his rescue still lingered, but it was starting to fade, replaced by something stronger. The bears hadn't just saved his life, they had taught him something. Nature was powerful and unpredictable, yes, but it was also capable of incredible kindness. The forest had shown him both its dangers and its beauty, and Max realized that he would never see it the same way again. He closed his notebook and looked out at the trees, the shadows deepening as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. "Thank you," he whispered again, his voice steady this time. He didn't know if the bears were listening, but he hoped they were. He hoped they knew how much their actions had meant to him. As Max stood to leave, a soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of pine. It felt like a goodbye, gentle and fleeting, and Max smiled as he turned back toward his house. The forest had given him a gift, a second chance, a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. And for that, he would always be grateful.